Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how speech sounds are segmented and how words and word boundaries are learned. So now let's move on to how speech is processed in the brain. And we'll kind of finish with this section. So, one of the things that is especially difficult, especially when you're dealing with the temporal lobes, and the temporal lobes in particular seem to be really critical for aspects related to both music perception and speech perception. Now, one thing is that a very common type of brain damage that happens in the temporal lobes is usually due to a stroke. Many of the major cerebral arteries kind of cluster around the temporal lobes, and because of that, brain damage will typically be due to patterns of blood vessels rather than brain function. So, brain damage will often follow a pattern of blood vessels and not really brain function itself. So, you don't know, especially when you're dealing with things like stroke or hemorrhage, you don't always have really clean lesions to really talk about. So, if we're looking at brain damage, it's a little bit difficult to figure out how much of that is due to things like stroke or how much of that is due to damage to a specific area. So oftentimes, instead of looking at patterns of brain damage, we instead utilize both PET scans and fMRI scans because we don't necessarily need to worry about a lesion in those cases. So generally, we tend to find that both the left and the right superior temporal lobes are more strongly activated in response to speech than to non-speech sounds. And if you've had biopsych or cognitive psych with me, the superior temporal lobes actually make sense, especially the left superior temporal lobe. That is Wernicke's area, which is an area that is really critical for speech comprehension. If that area is damaged, you can produce speech, but it won't really make a lot of sense. Now, one of the big problems with doing speech research and neuroimaging is that when you're comparing speech sounds versus non-speech sounds, it's really hard to create well controlled non-speech stimuli because we are very, very good at detecting speech even when the signal is degraded in some way. So we're going to look at a couple of instances where people have actually tried to create good variations of non-speech stimuli. So for example, one study has kind of looked at this. So here you can see a spectrogram of the sentence, the wife helped her husband. So that's what the overall sentence is. Now in this case, they have there are frequency changes and changes in amplitude. So there are different stressed and unstressed sounds, and additionally, there are varying frequencies. We can modify this signal by not changing the frequency, but changing the amplitude, by changing the frequency even more, but not the amplitude. And this actually creates very non-speech-like things. So this is a categorical perception task. Listeners had to attempt to discriminate sounds like ba and da while having their brain scanned. And as sounds became more complex, they end up getting processed by more anterior and ventral regions of superior temporal cortex. So the more speech-like that things become, the more they activate areas of the superior temporal lobes, like Wernicke's area. And additionally, some speech areas will become more active when lip reading, which means that we do utilize visual information to help us decode speech as well. So when you're presented with these kind of hybrid sentences that produce very degraded non-speech-like sounds, you can kind of see some of the major areas that get involved. In particular, as things become more speech-like, this area in purple in particular becomes especially active, but a variety of different speech and non-speech sounds will also activate other portions of the superior temporal lobes, both on the left and the right. Really, only the left side in particular is really particularly tuned to those speech sounds, and this actually corresponds quite a bit to Wernicke's area. One of the other, sorry, go back. So one of the other things that we know, because of what we know about speech sounds, a lot of research has been done with intercranial electrodes. So electrodes that are placed right on the cortex itself. And usually you would want to do this to basically make sure that before you do brain surgery, that you're not removing areas that produce speech arrest. So you want to make sure as much as possible to preserve speech in these particular areas. So electrodes are basically implanted to determine the function of certain areas so that when you engage in these surgical procedures, you're basically not removing an area that would be detrimental for speech perception or speech production. All right, folks, so that is all I had. Thank you very much for putting up with my singing. Again, for that extra credit, try to find me a ridiculous, sad cover of a song that's used in like a trailer or on TV. Just give me an example through email or through the Discord, and I'll give you some extra credit. All right, have a wonderful week. I will have the study guide up for your third exam very, very soon. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you soon.